guest is James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he has worked and lived since 2004. James, sorry your Calgary Flames have been eliminated from the Stanley Cup playoffs, but your cousins who live to the north in Edmonton are still in it.
Yes, well, it's such a brotherly, friendly relationship between Calgary and Edmonton. I guess I'll settle for that.
I've got family in both. I know all about it. James, North Korea, of course, the loose cannon on deck in the world right now. How concerned is Japan about it, and is it affecting the Japanese economy at all?
Well, it is certainly affecting the news cycle here, and I think the fear has been ratcheted up. It's certainly leading the news these days, and people are at least talking about it. I don't know how concerned the average person on the street is in their day-to-day life, but the government seems to be doing their best to make people concerned about it. In fact, the city of Osaka has issued a guide that I tweeted out recently about what to do, if you're out and about and a missile is fired at Japan, or what to do if you're at home and a missile is fired at Japan, or what to do if your child is at nursery school and a missile is fired at Japan. It's a very strange document, the kind that I think would only be issued by a Japanese government agency. But at any rate, that's the kind of stuff that the people here are being subjected to on a pretty much a daily basis at this point. So it is certainly affecting people's conversations, but in terms of economic disruption, I guess we'll have to see. But all the indicators that we've seen so far this year have, in fact, if anything, been fairly positive. In fact, the Bank of Japan has just upgraded their forecast for the GDP growth this year from its 1.5%, from 1.2% that they were predicting earlier. They're now predicting 1.5%. So it is. It seems that it hasn't affected domestic operations or demand here at this point, but certainly I think the idea is that fear is being placed in the public consciousness.
How have Samsung's problems with exploding phones, exploding dishwashers or clothing washers? How has that played out, and are they recovering from it?
Well, not only are they recovering, but surprisingly they're doing, if not well, they're at least doing better than expected. In fact, the latest headlines out from Bloomberg is that Samsung has rejected a holding company push as profit tops estimates. And basically there's an activist investor, Paul Elliott Singer, who has been pushing for the Samsung to convert into a holding company. But now that they're posting quarterly profits that top analyst estimates, apparently they're not going to do that. And the Samsung G8 has just launched and is getting, if not stunningly positive reviews, at least positive enough that it looks like they may actually recover from this fiasco of the exploding smartphones. That was yesterday's Samsung. So it looks like all things are looking up for Samsung at this point.
In South Korea, how nervous are people?
I think people would have, I'm not there on the ground, so I can't speak to that, but I think people would have to be even more concerned than they are in Japan, because of course it's not just the threat of North Korea lobbing some missile, it's the threat of an actual invasion, which is a real, at least, possibility. And of course people have to keep in mind that Seoul is not very far from the North Korean border. And that has always been something that's been thought of and planned for in military operations when they're doing their exercises and other things on the Korean Peninsula. The idea that the North could send in actual physical troops, or maybe do something crazy and launch a missile. And of course, any nuclear event anywhere on the Korean Peninsula affects both sides equally. There's not some mystical, magical barrier at the border. So anything that happens to destabilize the North is probably going to affect the South. So obviously it's a very pressing problem. It's got to be at the forefront of a lot of people's attention, or at least it would be in any other time. But of course, South Korea is going through its own political upheaval right now, as of course we've just seen the impeachment of the president and now the selection of a new one. It's a pretty topsy-turvy time for Koreans in general, I would say.
What was behind the impeachment?
There was a scandal involving an advisor who was perhaps Svengaling the president and giving some advice that served her own interests. And when this relationship was revealed, it basically sent the president tumbling, who was a pretty controversial president anyway, and was the daughter of a former dictator of the country, so not exactly popular amongst all quarters. So I think her support base was tenuous at best, even in good times. And of course, this scandal basically upset that balance of power and sent her toppling. And, well, I mean, Korea is still fairly a fledgling democracy at this point, not a democracy for very many decades. So I think this type of thing can really destabilize the political process there. So it will be interesting to see what ends up resulting from this and how the political landscape shapes as a result of what's going on there.
Has South Korea ever considered moving their capital from Seoul to some city much further away from North Korea?
I don't know if that has been considered. It would certainly seem to make more strategic sense if you are considering the possibility of an invasion from the north, but perhaps it's a sign of resilience and determination in and of itself that the capital city is so close to that border. At any rate, it certainly does put even more emphasis on the necessity for security along the demilitarized zone. And it has to be, as I say, something that's taken into account in all of the security and military exercises that go on there on a regular basis. And, I mean, again, perhaps that would just be a question of protecting the government if they made a move like that, because obviously it is the most populous city in Korea and houses up to half of the country's entire population. So they might, I suppose they could consider moving government offices further south, but it wouldn't change the fact that Seoul is still really the center of the country economically and population, demographically speaking.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after this.
I'm Bill McWilliam, president of Cascadero Copper, CCD on the TSX Venture Exchange. Cesium is one of the world's rarest metals with a growing industrial demand. Drilling is underway on our Tehran property in Argentina to prove up a cesium resource. Cascadero's patent-pending leach process has the potential to make Cascadero the lowest cost supplier of cesium in the world. Visit our website, cascadero.com, or phone us at 604-924-5504.
GEM International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International Spotlight is on an 1109 carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. GEM International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. It seems Trump has died down his rhetoric against China after he met with the Chinese leadership. But economically, China still is doing well, are they?
They certainly are on the bigger scheme of things. And there are, of course, slowdowns and problems here and there. And we've seen some problems in the Chinese stock market again, but I don't think anyone really puts too much faith in the Chinese stock market to begin with. So I'm not sure if that's really a sign of the overall Chinese economy, which is still, of course, mostly an export manufacturing-based economy, although China is doing its level best to try to change that dynamic in various ways, including, of course, the creation of their trillion-dollar gamble on this, what they call the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is the attempt to create a Silk Road economic belt, which is a shipping and trade route, a trade route that will run from China into Europe, and then a shipping route called the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which will basically, of course, run through that heavily contested South China Sea area into the Indian Ocean and off to Africa, into Europe and the Mediterranean. So they are really pushing that right now, and they're signing deals with many different countries. They're pumping billions of dollars investments into various rail and maritime infrastructure with various countries. And of course, this isn't just an economic consideration, although that's obviously part of it. But when you look at some of the things that they're investing in right now, like the Pakistan-Chinese economic corridor, it doesn't really make a lot of economic sense all by itself. They're pumping as much as $40 billion into that. when people have questioned how much will actually be earned from it. But of course, it's more also about the geopolitical ties, because with growing economic clout comes growing geopolitical clout. And how do you secure that? Well, probably one of the best ways is forming these types of physical infrastructure relationships with a lot of your trading partners. And so I think that's the approach that China is taking. And I think one important facet of that is that China has just launched its first domestically manufactured aircraft carrier. They have one other aircraft carrier, which was a refurbished Soviet Kuznetsov-class carrier, but they've just launched their new Type 001A vessel, which has not been named, but for those keeping track at home, is probably going to be named the Shandong. But at any rate, it was just towed out of dry dock just last week. So they are making some significant moves, and obviously that's an important move towards creating more of a forward expeditionary force for the People's Liberation Army Navy, which they are hoping, I think, to extend China's influence out even as far into the Indian Ocean. And I think that's tied in with all of these economic concerns and the creation of this bigger initiative. So clearly China is looking right now, I think, at taking its economic clout that it's built up over the past couple of decades and trying to turn that into geopolitical clout.
Yes, aircraft carriers really are a projection of a country's might and ambition. That's why the U.S. has so many of them. Could you see the Chinese challenging the U.S. for domination of the oceans?
There is, I think, no question at this point who would win in an all-out military battle. Of course, China now has 2 aircraft carriers, although this new domestically manufactured aircraft carrier is still not operational and will not be deployed operationally for some time. So even there, I think even that's a bit premature to be talking about in any operational capacity, but certainly it does not compare to the United States' ability militarily if there was an all-out confrontation, which is, I think, why the Chinese have really no interest in sparking such a confrontation at this point. I think if anything, if there is a strategy involved, it would be more the long game of trying to basically let the U.S. deplete itself in the Middle East and other places so that they will not be as much of a threat in the South China Sea and other places where China has its own strategic interests.
Is there any actual proof that North Korea has been launching missiles that are landing in the Sea of Japan?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think there is anyone or on any side of this, Chinese or Russian or the U.S. or others, who have said that these launches are not happening. So I don't think that that's a question. The question really is, to what extent is this capacity really operational? For example, we do know that obviously North Korea does have a nuclear program and are testing nuclear devices, but there's still no indication that they've come anywhere close to the type of miniaturization of those nuclear warheads that would be needed to put them on top of an ICBM, on top of the fact that they have not yet demonstrated that they have ICBM capabilities. They have some medium-range missiles, which presumably potentially maybe could hit Hawaii, but in terms of their ICBM capability, they say that they're on the verge of being able to test such a device, which would theoretically be able to hit the United States. But we haven't seen that yet. And so it is a question of who exactly is checking and how is it being verified, how many launches and what types of missiles, et cetera. And to a certain extent, we have to rely on various government agencies' word for these types of things. But at any rate, I think it's pretty certain that North Korea does have some sort of missile technology capability, and they are testing it. I think the real question is it really a threat militarily to the United States? It's certainly not an existential threat. Could it even theoretically hit the United States? Well, nothing that we've seen so far. So I think that type of kind of hysteria that we see coming out of the American media is way overplayed at this point.
Plus, I'm sure a good number of spy satellites are focused on North Korea, where basically you have a Hubble telescope, but instead of peering into the universe, you're peering at the Earth, and you can read license plates with it. So you can see quite a bit, I would think.
Well, let's put it this way. Alex, I'm sure everyone in the audience has used Google Maps and Google Earth at some point, and that is ancient technology by spy standards. So can you imagine how much more advanced the U.S. intelligence agency's technology for for seeing into a country really is. I'm pretty sure that if it's visible and on the ground, they'll have a way of seeing it, and perhaps even seeing beyond that if they can see infrared and other types of signatures.
We'll have more with James Corbett right after this.
Lotus Ventures Inc. is a BC-based medical marijuana company poised to launch into the rapidly evolving cannabis sector. Lotus is in the final review stage of the Health Canada approvals to become a licensed producer, having arranged facility financing of up to $12 million, plus building permits for its prototype indoor production facility. Shares trade under the symbol J on the Canadian Securities Exchange. Visit our website at lotusventures.ca.
Keep informed. Receive our weekly recap of thought-provoking articles, podcasts, and radio delivered to your inbox for free. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage, HowStreet.com. Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. James, is China still printing money like crazy?
Well, yes, the Chinese phenomenon has, over the last several years, been predicated on basically the open spigot of easy credit, and China has attempted to ease off on that spigot numerous times over the past several years, and that has every single time resulted in some sort of cash crunch that has caused a mini panic, at any rate, or the beginning of a panic until they let the spigot loose. So there is still easy credit available in China, and to a large extent that's the type of thing that the nouveau riche, or at least nouveau sort of riche in China, are using to try to leverage their newfound wealth. These wealth management products and other shadow banking industry products that are precarious at best and really Ponzi schemes when you look at them, because they're generally predicated on new people buying the latest offerings from the bank in order to finance the people who bought in the previous offerings. So we've seen some hair-raising activity there, and at this point, again, other than growing the Chinese economy out of that bubble, I'm not sure there's a way out of it, and I think that has to be one of the considerations going into this $1 trillion Belt Road Initiative project.
Car sales in China, how are they going? Are they still booming? I'm just taking a look on Google as well.
I would have to check on the latest data. I know that car sales have been taking off in recent years. Certainly, the industry is doing well. And the last I heard, China's car sales were set to overtake the U.S. car sales within 7 years. So take that estimate for what it's worth. But at any rate, it is growing, and it is on the upswing. So, and it really is, of course, just a matter of demographics. Obviously, with a population 4 times that of the United States, they're at some point going to overtake the U.S. In terms of just the size of their market. So I think that, again, is just a reflection of overall growing wealth in the Chinese economy, but that causes all sorts of other concerns. And I do remember when I was in Beijing finding out about the car lottery system whereby people were allowed to buy cars if they won a certain lottery, because, of course, you can't have people just buying cars willy-nilly in a crowded place like Beijing. And then who can drive cars on what days, another, license plate lottery type system and things like this to try to limit the growing congestion on the roads. So I think it's a monumental headache for the would-be central planners of China, the fact that the industry is generally on the increase.
Well, last year they sold 24.38 million cars in China, and it looks like every year it increases by about 3 million a year. So, yes.
That's right. And they're estimating 30 million by 2020 and 35 million by 2025.
Like you said, in Beijing, I've seen pictures of the traffic jams, terrific freeways, but not an efficient way to get on or off.
No, it can be quite chaotic, and I think that's obviously something that the Chinese government keeps in mind, and especially a very, very concerned a government that's very concerned with central planning. I think it has to be doubly concerned with the possibility of road chaos. So I think this is something that the central planners and the city planners have really been thinking about in recent years.
The building of artificial islands in the South China Sea, are those plans still going ahead?
They certainly are, and it will be very interesting to see how this develops in the coming months, really. I think this is when we'll start to get the indication of which way the Trump administration under Secretary of State Tillerson is going. But yes, the artificial islands are still there and still being constructed. And we had that interesting exchange during Tillerson's confirmation hearing where he appeared to say that they would stop China from any further activity on those islands, which could really only be interpreted in the context of what he was saying to mean they would militarily stop China from accessing those islands. And they did, I think, walk that back after the confirmation hearings itself. It will be interesting to see ultimately what results from that. But if there is any sort of indication of where that's going to go, I think we can see it from the Xi Jinping/Trump meeting at the Mar-a-Lago, where, as you noted before, it seems Trump has walked back from his campaign rhetoric about declaring China a currency manipulator, which he declared repeatedly he would do on day one in office. Well, now as we approach day 100, he's saying they're not a currency manipulator, and that seems to be a part of the quid pro quo about the North Korea situation and China agreeing to keep their North Korean brethren in line. So we'll see how that relationship works out. But at any rate, China is continuing its operations on the islands, and there's no sign that they're going to stop.
James, anything else you wanted to bring up?
There's much going on that I think is of interest, perhaps for people who are interested in the Japanese market in particular. I think there's an interesting article up on Nikkei.com about crimped market ever reliant on BOJ lending government bonds, which is kind of the catch-22 of the Japanese increase in GDP expectations, which we were talking about earlier. The other side of that is that the markets have been supported, specifically the bond market has been supported by the BOJ, which has been buying government bonds like they're going out of style, which has actually left a dearth of bonds left for financial institutions to purchase. So they're increasingly relying on overnight lending from the BOJ directly, which is obviously much more costly for them. It's creating a problem. Basically, the Bank of Japan is buying too many bonds. There aren't enough for financial institutions to use to secure their securities. So that is an interesting squeeze. And what it says is ultimately that the BOJ can't go on with its bond buying forever, and it can't increase that indefinitely. They have their policy where they're trying to keep 10-year rates down to 0%. Well, that requires them buying more and more JGBs, and that might not be physically possible. They really are buying up the market at this point. So that is an interesting conundrum. And then, again, it's one of those situations where unless the Japanese domestic market grows its way out of that problem, it's likely to be a type of, an increasing concern for people in the market here. So once again, I think the central banks are dictating economic reality more so than any actual underlying economic conditions, and that's going to come back and bite people in the posterior at some point.
James, thank you so much for chatting with us, and good luck with Japan's new missile defense system against North Korea.
Thank you. I'll let you know if it works.
Thank you very much again. My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He was speaking to us from Japan. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.
News these days, and people are at least talking about it. I don't know how concerned the average person on the street is in their day-to-day life, but the government seems to be doing their best to make people concerned about it. In fact, the city of Osaka has issued a guide that I tweeted out recently about what to do, if you're out and about and a missile is fired at Japan, or what to do if you're at home and a missile is fired at Japan, or what to do if your child is at nursery school and a missile is fired at Japan. It's a very strange document, the kind that I think would only be issued by a Japanese government agent.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan, where he has worked and lived since 2004.
It seems that it hasn't affected domestic operations or demand here at this point, but certainly I think the idea is that fear is being placed in the public consciousness.
How have Samsung's problems with exploding phones, exploding dishwashers or clothing washers, how has that played out, and are they recovering from it?
Well, not only are they recovering, but surprisingly they're doing, if not well, they're at least doing better than expected. In fact, the latest headlines out from Bloomberg is that Samsung has rejected a holding company push, but at any rate, that's the kind of stuff that the people here are being subjected to on a pretty much a daily basis at this point. So it is certainly affecting people's conversations. But in terms of economic disruption, I guess we'll have to see. But all the indicators that we've seen so far this year have, in fact, if anything, been fairly positive. In fact, the Bank of Japan has just upgraded their forecast for the GDP growth this year from its 1.5%, from 1.2% that they were predicting earlier. They're now predicting 1.5%. So it is.
James, sorry, your Calgary Flames have been eliminated from the Stanley Cup playoffs, but your cousins who live to the north in Edmonton are still in it.
Yes, well, it's such a brotherly, friendly relationship between Calgary and Edmonton. I guess I'll settle for that.
I've got family in both. I know all about it. James, North Korea, of course, the loose cannon on deck in the world right now. How concerned is Japan about it, and is it affecting the Japanese economy at all?
Well, it is certainly affecting the news cycle here, and I think the fear has been ratcheted up. It's certainly leading the